From the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 25th chapter, verses 1 through 13. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout. "Look, here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamp. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the banquet hall, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaid came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." One of the many things that my father taught me to appreciate were the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, specifically Sherlock Holmes, the great detective of Victorian England. Sherlock Holmes isn't a hero because he's stronger or faster than anybody else, or even necessarily that he's smarter than anybody else. He's a hero because he notices things that everyone else overlooks. He was the original CSI before we had all these cool technologies that we see on television shows today. In one of his stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes, Holmes is tracking down a criminal by looking at the hoof prints from a getaway horse. And he notices a particular pattern left by custom horseshoes. He notices these little details because he keeps his eyes open all the time and is always aware that things are not what they seem to be. Several of the lectionaries you had read to this morning from Psalms and from the letter of Paul to Thessalonica Church and Matthew's Gospel are strong exhortations for us to keep our eyes open and not to assume too much about the world. These texts are often misunderstood because us 21st century folks fail to understand the first century audience to whom they were written. In fact, Paul's letter to the church of Thessalonica is likely the earliest of Paul's writing, and as such, they reflect a certain attitude he had toward the establishment of these churches prior to the time that he's writing to Timothy, for instance, when he's in prison. His mindset is different. Paul, like many of the first generation Christians, believed that the world was coming to an end soon. They expected Jesus to be coming back in their lifetime. They weren't thinking about something centuries down the road or maybe never. They were thinking very soon. Some people who read this passage today, and some of our faith communities still believe that. They're waiting for an imminent rapture. The outpouring of God's wrath has been popularized in some writings like the Left Behind books, but all Paul was really doing was reassuring the people that no one, whether they were alive or dead, would be excluded from God's kingdom. And then instead of worrying about that, he encouraged them to be ready and watchful for what God might do in the future. And we see Jesus preaching the same sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. He says, "Be ready, be watchful for whatever it is that God may be doing." Now, as we enter this holiday season, everyone starts getting busy with making traveling plans and buying gifts and cooking meals and decorating. and going to galas like I attended last night for Good Samaritans Network. And as I look at my own calendar, I think, there's not enough time to do all this stuff. And you guys are probably in the same situation. In the midst of all this busyness at this time of the year between now and the end of December, one of the best things that we can do for ourselves, one of the best things that we can do for others, is actually to take some time to sit back and observe the surroundings around us. Is everything exactly as it should be? Or could God be using something in our everyday circumstances to call us out, to remind us what's really important? Could God still be whispering in that still, small voice? We'd only know if we take the time to listen and to watch. Now, you know some people who live that way all the time. I know that some cancer survivors and some who didn't survive live each day of their life as if it is their last. I remember as a youth, when I first decided that ministry was going to be in my future, I would volunteer to be a hospice volunteer. And I remember going to visit a man in Noblesville who had been diagnosed with lung cancer and was given less than a year to live. But during that year, he indeed did live. He had been a really heavy smoker, which isn't all that impressive if you think about, we're talking about in the early 60s, because back then, everybody smoked, it seemed to be. And in fact, this last week, I was watching some vintage black and white movies, including Holiday Inn, and I noticed that everybody had a cigarette hanging out of their mouth. Yeah. So, the fact that he was smoking back then is not all that uncommon. Well, anyway, this man decided that since he was a smoker, and was still pretty young, he was in his mid-40s, but he was dying, that the thing that he should do was get out and speak to as many people as he could about stopping smoking and what God had done in his life for him, even in this serious situation. And that's exactly what he did. He went to schools and to churches and civic organizations, and he told people his story. He gave them his narrative, his story about how smoking and not living in good relationship with God and with others had tarnished his life. And I remember one of the things he said, it was like this because he had never been watchful. He never paid close attention to what was really going on. He wasn't aware, even though he knew that, because even then they had warnings on cigarettes, that if you smoke heavy for an enormous amount of time, there's a really good chance you're going to get lung cancer, and you may die from it. He hadn't watched closely enough to be aware of the fact that when he said mean things to other people, when he didn't help other people, that he was not only affecting his own life, but he was affecting literally hundreds of other people's lives. He hadn't been observant. He hadn't been that Sherlock Holmes, paying close attention. He had lived a life with a lot of bitterness, and he hadn't really appreciated what was around him and who was around him. He spoke about his pain and about his impending death and the great pain that it would cause for his family and his friends, and how, because he hadn't paid attention, all these broken relationships that he had left in his path. But now, he said, I am paying attention to everything. And God is using whatever time I have left on this earth to share the importance with others about not smoking or quitting if you do smoke, and the importance of caring for others, not only yourself. He was like many hospice patients I visited in my lifetime as a clergy. It seems to me that folks, once they get in that state, are very attuned to what is going on around them. They see and hear things that me and you pay absolutely no attention to. In my years as a hospital chaplain, I heard narratives all the time of people saying things to me that went right over my head because I hadn't been watching. I remember as a volunteer in hospice that I went to visit a woman in Pendleton, Indiana, who was dying from cancer. She was aged, she was fragile, and she was old. And when I went to visit her at this beautiful Victorian home in Pendleton, and it was a beautiful Victorian home, I expected her to be angry or bragging about her beautiful home, all the great furniture, the home decor, and maybe ask me to take her shopping or go shopping for her. But no, instead, here's what she wanted me to do. She wanted me to put bird seed in her bird feeders so she could watch the birds of the air come and eat. And on one visit, she actually convinced me, I'm not sure still to this day how she convinced me, this is a big old Victorian home, but she convinced me to climb out the top story window with her onto the roof, because she just wanted to watch the clouds rolling by in the sky. She wanted to suck in all life there was left, but not in ways that I would have expected and perhaps you would expect. But she was prepared to observe and appreciate all God and all this world had to offer. She was a Sherlock Holmes. She was observing things that we miss. This parable of Jesus really hits home for me because the truth is, I like to be prepared. And Jeff was teasing me back here before church this morning. But I think it's a good idea to have my sermon completely scripted to preach before I come in to be with my flock. And I'm in favor of savings accounts and life insurance and taking care of my physical and mental health. You know, I exercise every day at the YMCA, and I'm working on my doctorate to keep my brain going. And I don't want to become a burden on anybody else. I believe in being prepared, and my guess is that a whole bunch of you, maybe all of you, like to be prepared as well. I mean, we're kind of part of a culture that worships planning and forethought and preparation for the unknown that lies ahead. It's probably why we get so angry when something doesn't go exactly as we think, that it causes our emotions to run away with us. You know, when we see a war that goes bad, and budgets overspent, emergency procedures that aren't filling enough holes, or it looks like we've done something and it turns out not to be, we get upset about it and get worried because that's not the way the plan was supposed to work. I don't like much those smarty pants bridesmaids that had the oil and wouldn't share it, but the truth is, I certainly recognize them. Now, of course, the parable doesn't tell us everything about the bridesmaids and about the oil they had at home. It doesn't tell us if the wise ones were hoarding it or if the foolish ones hadn't had time to get to the store yet. It doesn't tell us what their savings accounts or how generous they were with their worldly goods. For all we know, the wise bridesmaids were down to their last flask of oil that they had, and they brought it with them. And the foolish bridesmaid might have been sitting on barrels of oil back home. The parable just doesn't tell us that. It only concerns itself with what they had brought when they left home. It doesn't say a word about their motives or any extenuating circumstances or reasons why 5 women might conceivably have their oil flask at home. Maybe it's really not a story about how much oil you have. Maybe it's a story about how much oil you carry with you. The parable is clear. All 10 bridesmaids had lamps. And all 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were wise. The wise ones brought flasks of oil with their lamps when it was time to wait for the bridegroom. The foolish ones showed up with lamps and nothing to keep them going. And when the lamps went out, you may have gallons and gallons of oil at home, but it's not going to do you any good. So what does that look like, the kind of oil you carry with you? What does that look like if it's a commodity that we buy and sell? I remember back in my seminary days, we heard a lecture about the spiritual life of a preacher. One time during the lecture, a professor brought in an oil lamp, the kind with the wick and the oil down below, you actually light with a lighter, to use a visual aid. And the professors talked about how the role of the pastor, the role of a Christian for that is to be the light for others, or as we like to say, the light of the world. Then they lit the wick and watched the lamp burn. But then here was the rig part that they had put into it. Because there was only a small amount of oil in the lamp, it only burned for a few moments. They asked us students, what happens when the oil runs out? Then the lamp goes out, and you have nothing to light your way. And a pastor with no oil, a Christian with no oil, can't be the light of the world for anybody. What fills you up spiritually when you're dry? What replenishes your oil? Where do you find God, and how can you make sure you get enough of that oil for your lamp so that God can fill you up again? Because trust me, brothers and sisters, there will be times in your life that you will run dry. And when you do, you can't be a light for anybody. Remember that safety speech, if you've flown on an airplane before, you hear over the headphones, in the event of oemergency, oxygen masks will drop from the ceiling. Please be sure to secure your own oxygen mask first before assisting others. I'm a pastor in a church at this moment, but I'm also a father, a spouse, a teacher, and a friend. I'm a Christian, and I know what it means to run out of oil. And I'm guessing that you too know what that feels like. Perhaps you walked into the kitchen at 5:30 and had a child say, "What's for dinner?" And you say, "Meatloaf." And your children say, "What? Again? Meatloaf?" And you become amorphous of Godzilla then, right? Ah! Meatloaf, sit down! And when you finish ranting, your child calmly looks at you and says, "Let me guess, you're out of oil." It's fairly simple. When the arrow on the gas tank points to empty, you're going to run out of gas. If a 2-year-old doesn't take a nap, she's going to crash sometime during the day. When you haven't had a conversation with your spouse in 3 weeks, except for something revolving about carpooling, your marriage is going to get dry. If you've worked 80 hours for longer than you care to know, your relationships are going to suffer. It's not really something you can avoid. There are some kinds of fuel that are just not negotiable. And if you eat junk food, or you smoke, or you haven't exercised for 20 years, your body's going to let you know. Now, there are also some kinds of oils that you can't borrow from anyone else. Ask some teenagers. Or remember back to when you were teenagers. They learn a point. Probably almost everyone in here at some point wanted to borrow someone else's homework. "Oh, I didn't get mine done last night because I was watching Batman, and I need to get that taken care of. Can I borrow your homework?" That works, except you can't have the same preparation for a test. They've studied for a test and you haven't. So while you might have turned your homework in, it looks like, boy, I really know what I'm doing. When it goes to test time, you're in trouble because it's pretty obvious you have no clue what's going on. It's also true that while there are reserves in each one of us, no one else can build them up for us. You can't borrow someone else's peace of mind. You can't borrow someone else's passion for God. You can't say to a friend, "You have such a happy marriage. Can I have part of that for my marriage?" It just doesn't work. You find it out for yourself. You can have to figure what fills you up spiritually and then make sure that you have some to carry on in those days when every single minute of the day seems like your oil is being drained because you need it. And here's the thing. You are going to run out. There are days in my life as a pastor I'm thinking, why am I doing this? I'm well educated. I'm still physically fit. Mostly have my right mind. I could be making a lot more money, have a lot more sphere of influence than doing what I do. But I'm aware that time will run out for us all. The hour gets late and everyone gets sleepy. we all doze off and say, one of these days, I'm going to quit working so hard and I'm going to give quality time to my kids. Or one of these days, I'm going to take up painting because I've always wanted to do that. I really wanted to express myself through art. Or one of these days, I'm going to stop writing checks and really get involved down at the homeless shelter. But we all doze. We all put it off. And then the shout comes out. He's coming. It's time. And one of these days is today. And it's over, and you never get to bring your flask of oil out again. I think that one of the hardest things about this parable is a time will come when you have to draw the oil you have right there on your body in your flask. It's not going to come from your pension savings. It's not going to come from your good intentions or your long-range plans. It's going to come from the flask of your spiritual life that you have right now. Sherlock Holmes observed all small things others were missing because he paid attention. Things that we didn't see, he saw. I'm going to tell you, your oil will come from where you see God today. Don't wait to see God. I'm going to pay attention to God in a few years when I retire, or when I have a little bit more money, or when I lose 10 pounds, or when I have time, when there's not a football game today, or a party to go to. Your spiritual oil will come from how and where you see God today, this time, right now. And where is that? It's pretty simple. Jesus was a great storyteller, a great parable. He shared with us all the time through his stories, and especially the Matthew scriptures that we've been reading for several weeks now through the lectionary are filled with parables. So Jesus tells us, where can that oil come from? Here's what Jesus said. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was in prison, and you visited me. I was sick, and you comforted me. That's where we find Jesus. That's where we get filled up. That's where we gather the fruits of the Spirit of love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All those things, we can't check them out of a library. We can't borrow them from our next door neighbor. All those things are just there for us to gather in and ready for us to use. I'm aware of the fact that some church folk use this parable that we read this morning as a way to scare people straight, so to speak. But I think they're missing the point. You don't fill the lamp because you're afraid. Because you think, if I don't, I'll get locked out of the kingdom of heaven. You don't stockpile oil so you can turn everybody else away and have all the fun yourself. No, you just stop at the filling station and fill your flask and take it with you because you can't wait to meet the bridegroom. You fill it out of joy. That's the only price of oil when you think about it. The desire to meet Jesus when he comes, which he will soon and very soon. I want you to look into the eyes of whoever's sitting next to you. Look into their eyes and stare at them. Keep your eyes there, and I want you to repeat after me. I love you. Now I want you to, either that same person or another person, I want you to look into their eyes deeply and repeat after me. You are a freak. Because you are a freak. If you understood this parable this morning, if you listen closely to what it is that Jesus is saying in this parable, you are a freak. Because most people in this world aren't concerned about feeding those who are hungry. Most people aren't concerned about giving drink to those who are thirsty. Most people are not interested in clothing those who are naked, or welcoming a stranger, or visiting people who are in prison, or comforting the sick. So you're a freak. If you're really a Christian and you really believe the gospel, you're a freak. Because you really believe these things. You think it's important to make sure that when people are hungry, they are fed. That when people are thirsty, that they get a drink. That when people are naked, so to speak, that you clothe them. That when a stranger comes among you, whether it's in this church or on the street, that you welcome them with a smile and with love and hope. That when someone's sick and perhaps dying, that you offer them comfort. That's what Christ is calling you to this morning in this parable. Your oil will burn out. Make sure your spiritual life is there that can be replenished quickly. Because indeed, Jesus will come soon. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Praise be to God.